Scheler was involved in the early development of the phenomenological movement in Germany. He came to phenomenology only after his dissertation work through his reading of Husserl's logical investigations. But by the time of Husserl's publication of Ideas 1 in 1913, Scheler claims to have worked out some of his own distinctive directions of phenomenology, independent of Husserl's. I'd like to explore with you one central aspect of Scheler's thought, namely his phenomenology of valuing. First, consider whether acts of valuing, such as love or preferring, etc., are prior to acts of perception. Scheler claims that values have an independent and prior mode of givenness to the givenness of their objective bearers. We first encounter the world as value-laden and engage with our environment and social milieu to the extent that we are motivated through an apprehension of values. A value precedes its object, Scheler writes. It is the first messenger of its particular nature. The axiological nuance is the first factor that comes upon us in any experience. If at least two aspects constitute an experience, for example, the empirical properties on the one hand and the value quality on the other hand, it seems we don't first perceive the thing in terms of its properties and characteristics, and only subsequently infer about its value. Rather, we first have an intuitive sense of something's value, which then prompts further consideration of its properties, at least insofar as apprehending value sparks an interest in observation. We can consider a work of art beautiful or ugly, distinguished or common, without awareness of which properties of the work prompt this assessment, Scheler thinks. Also, the communicable terms that correspond to values, such as charming, beautiful, good, or evil, are not originally conceptual terms that simply find their fulfillment in common objective characteristics. Rather, value givenness is the condition for the possible noticing of certain characteristics upon which we develop conceptual meanings. Next, consider whether value is reducible to the properties of things. Scheler claims that values cannot be reduced to perceptible characteristics of a thing or person. In fact, he warns against representationalizing or reifying values by identifying an object and the value of the object. Values are non-formal, non-representational qualities of objects, independent of the realm of goods in which they appear. Consider, for example, some things you find beautiful. What observable characteristic or property is common to all beautiful things that makes them beautiful? Or works of art, specifically. What is the characteristic that is common to all beautiful music or paintings? Scheler points out that each time we attempt to determine such common properties, we find our hands empty. The particular quality of the taste of a drink that makes it pleasant doesn't mean that everything pleasant or even every pleasant tasting drink must have the quality that makes the taste of this drink pleasant. Now, this problematizes moral judgment. We may be inclined to say that someone is good or bad if they have characteristic X or Y or Z, right? Historically, we've cycled through various attempts to identify the elusive moral trait, whether it's race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, political affiliation, down to traits as trivial as preferred sports teams or brands of clothing. Scheler writes that just as it is senseless to ask for the common properties of all blue or red things, since they have only blueness or redness in common, so is it senseless to ask for the common property of all good or evil deeds. And Scheler continues to say, to presume to bind good and evil to self-sufficient criteria from outside the domain of values, such as demonstrable bodily or psychic predispositions, or those of membership in a class or party, or to speak of the good and just or the evil and unjust as if they were an objectively determinable and definable class, is ultimately to confound or conflate possible bearers of the good with the corresponding values themselves. Finally, if value is irreducible to objective empirical properties and characteristics, and valuing is not merely an inference based upon empirical perception, then by what act do we apprehend value? Scheler answers that values are given by means of feelings and the whole spectrum of the emotional life, not just sensible feelings, but psychical or vital feelings and spiritual or intentional feelings, in particular, the intentional feeling of loving. Values, Scheler writes, are given first of all in feeling. In emotional experiences, the world of objects comes to the fore by itself, but only in terms of its value aspect. The value of physical pleasure, for example, is given in feeling pleasure, right? The disvalue of pain is given in feeling pain and in no other way. However, not all value is reducible to pleasure value or the value of the absence of pain. Something isn't of value only insofar as it provides pleasure. That is, pleasure isn't the only thing of value. Rather, we seek pleasure and the reduction of pain because of their value. This is why we sometimes endure pain for the sake of a higher value, such as health or intellectual or cultural growth. Love and hate, then, are acts in which the value realm accessible to the feeling of a being is either extended or narrowed, respectively. The acts of loving and hating are the bottom floor of human intentionality. They serve as an attitudinal predisposition of openness or closeness to values. Openness in the case of love, closeness in the case of hatred. And they're a qualitative precondition for the possibility of value givenness. Now, this view implies a strong moral imperative of love. The situation is not such that we perceive positive or negative values of persons, for example, in virtues or vices, and then justifiably either love or hate others insofar as they're seen to be a value, possessing virtue, or not a value, possessing vice. Rather, love is the very condition by which one's positive value is disclosed in the first place. And love, especially within a community of love, is also the very condition by which one comes to be a loving individual. All hatred, for Scheler, has a social root in the absence of love and the lack of having been loved. Scheler's value theory was interwoven not only in his ethical writings, but his personalism, philosophy of religion, sociology of knowledge, political and social philosophy, and later metaphysics and philosophical anthropology. My engagement with Scheler's thought focuses on personal identity, the value of individuality, and critical phenomenology, by which I mean employing phenomenological insight for social critique. I'm currently developing a Schelerian distinction between dehumanization and depersonalization. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions or comments. Thank you.